Ladies and gentlemen, this is Margaret Collins, the woman funding everything tonight, my daughter-in-law said with a bright, effortless smile, as if she were announcing the caterer instead of introducing me. And for a moment, the room filled with polite laughter, the kind that lingers just long enough to make sure you heard it, just long enough to make sure it stayed with you. I smiled too. Of course I did, because at 68 years old, you learn that dignity isn't something you protect with noise. It's something you carry quietly, even when people try to take it from you. And as I stood there in the middle of my grandson Lucas's 8th birthday party, holding a neatly wrapped box with a red ribbon and an envelope I had slipped inside with more money than I cared to admit, I realized something they didn't know yet, something I had already set into motion weeks before that moment, something that would make that little introduction the last time anyone ever used my generosity as a punchline. The backyard was decorated like something out of a magazine, pastel balloons tied to white chairs, a long table covered in desserts that looked too perfect to eat, a rented bounce house humming in the corner while children laughed and ran in circles, and I took it all in slowly, the way I always did, because I had paid for most of it. Not that anyone had asked me to, at least not directly. But there's a language families learn when money is involved, a quiet expectation, a look, a pause, a carefully worded sentence that always ends the same way. With me reaching for my checkbook, and I used to think that meant I was helping, that it meant I was loved, needed, valued, but standing there, hearing the way Vanessa's voice carried across the yard, light and joking and just sharp enough to cut, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not even sadness, just clarity. Ethan stood near the grill, flipping burgers like he always did at these gatherings, laughing with a group of his friends. And when his eyes briefly met mine, he looked away almost immediately, as if he hadn't heard what his wife had just said, or maybe as if he had and chose not to react, and that hurt more than the words themselves, not in a dramatic way, not in the way people expect pain to show itself, but in that quiet, steady way that builds over time, like a crack you don't notice until the whole structure begins to shift. I adjusted the bracelet on my wrist, the one my late husband had given me on our 40th anniversary, and walked further into the party, greeting guests, complimenting decorations, asking Lucas about his gifts, doing everything a grandmother is supposed to do, because habits don't disappear overnight, even when the meaning behind them changes, and every now and then, I would catch a snippet of conversation, a joke about expenses, a casual comment about how grandma always takes care of it. And each word felt less like a surprise and more like confirmation, as if the truth had been there all along, waiting for me to finally acknowledge it. Vanessa moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm whenever she passed him, her laughter bright, her tone always just on the edge of something sharper. And when she reached me again, placing a hand on my shoulder for the benefit of the guests nearby, she said, "We couldn't have done any of this without Margaret." And I nodded, smiling the same polite smile I had worn for years, because she was right. They couldn't have done it without me. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that for the first time in decades, I had finally decided to see exactly what my role in this family had become, and more importantly, what it was about to stop being. I stayed at the party longer than I needed to, long enough to watch the patterns I had ignored for years unfold in plain sight, long enough to see how easily my presence blended into the background once the introductions were over. And as the afternoon sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched across the yard, I noticed how no one came to ask me where I wanted to sit. No one checked if I had eaten. No one wondered if I was comfortable. And it was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was simply absence, the kind that feels deliberate when it repeats itself often enough. I picked up a paper plate and served myself a small portion of food, standing near the edge of the patio while conversations carried on around me. And I listened, not in a suspicious way, not yet, but in a way that comes naturally when you begin to realize you have been part of a conversation without ever truly being included in it. And somewhere behind me, I heard Vanessa again, her voice lower this time, speaking to one of her friends. She loves doing this. It makes her feel useful, followed by a soft laugh that was quickly echoed. And I did not turn around. I did not need to, because the meaning was already clear, and for the first time, I did not try to explain it away in my mind. I did not search for kinder interpretations. I simply let the words settle exactly as they were. Ethan passed by me a few minutes later, carrying a tray of drinks, and for a brief second, he slowed down as if he might say something. Perhaps ask if I needed anything. Perhaps acknowledge the moment in some small way, but instead he gave me a quick, distracted smile and continued walking. And that was when I understood that silence can be louder than any insult, because it confirms what words only suggest. I stepped away from the crowd and walked toward the far corner of the yard where the fence met a row of neatly trimmed hedges, a place where the noise softened and the air felt still, and I allowed myself a moment to breathe, not out of sadness, but out of recognition, because there is a difference between being overlooked once and being overlooked repeatedly, and I could suddenly see the pattern stretching back further than I had ever admitted to myself. Birthdays I had funded, vacations I had helped pay for, repairs on their home that had somehow become my responsibility, each instance framed as a small favor, a temporary need, something that would not happen again, and yet it always did. I thought about the envelope I had brought that day, still tucked neatly inside the gift box I had placed on the table earlier, and for a moment, I considered retrieving it, not out of spite, but out of a quiet understanding that the gesture no longer meant what I had believed it did, and then I realized something even more important. Something that made me straighten my shoulders and smooth the front of my dress before walking back toward the party. Because the truth was, the decision had already been made long before I arrived that afternoon, long before Vanessa's introduction, long before Ethan's silence. And as I rejoined the gathering with the same calm expression I had worn all day, I knew that what they were seeing now was the final version of someone they thought they understood, someone they believed would always say yes, always step in, always provide, and they had no idea that the version of me they relied on so comfortably had already begun to disappear. The rest of the afternoon unfolded exactly the way I expected once I allowed myself to see it clearly, every detail falling into place with a quiet precision that felt almost unsettling, as if I had been watching the same performance for years but had only just been handed the script. Lucas ran up to me at one point, his small hands sticky from frosting, his smile wide and genuine in a way that made my chest tighten just slightly, and he hugged me without hesitation, thanking me for the gift, before running back to his friends, and I rested my hand briefly on his shoulder as he left, reminding myself that not everything in that yard was hollow, that innocence still existed even in spaces shaped by calculation, and for a moment, I allowed that thought to steady me before I returned to observing the adults around me. Vanessa was opening a stack of envelopes at the gift table with careful attention, separating cards from boxes, her movements efficient, practiced, and when she reached the one I had brought, she paused just long enough to glance toward me, her expression unreadable for a fraction of a second before she slipped it into a separate pile, without comment, and I noticed that she did not open it, not there, not in front of anyone, as if she already assumed what was inside. As if the contents were not a surprise, but an expectation, something already accounted for in her plans. I watched that small moment closely, the way her fingers lingered on the envelope, the way she placed it slightly apart from the others, and it confirmed something I had only begun to suspect, that this was no longer about gratitude or even habit. It was about certainty, the kind that comes when someone believes they understand your limits better than you do, when they believe they can predict your choices before you make them. And I found that realization more instructive than hurtful, because it gave me something solid to work with. Later, as the cake was brought out and everyone gathered around the table, singing with cheerful voices that rose into the warm evening air, I stood near the back of the group, clapping along, my smile perfectly in place, and I noticed how naturally the scene arranged itself without me at the center. How easily the space I used to occupy had been reassigned, not taken by force, but simply shifted over time, and I did not step forward. I did not try to reclaim it, because I understood now that presence is not something you demand. It is something you allow, and I had been allowing too much. For too long. When the candles were blown out and the applause faded, Vanessa leaned in close to Ethan, saying something that made him laugh softly, and though I could not hear the words, I recognized the tone. The shared understanding, the quiet agreement that had become the foundation of their partnership, and I turned away before the moment could settle into anything heavier, because I no longer needed to decode every exchange to know where I stood. Instead, I walked toward the table where The gifts were arranged, my steps unhurried, my posture steady, and I adjusted the position of the box I had brought, straightening the ribbon slightly, as if it were just another small act of care, and in that simple movement, I felt the weight of every similar gesture I had made over the years, every contribution given without question, every assumption I had allowed to grow unchecked. And I realized that the real shift had already happened, not in them, but in me, because for the first time, I was no longer participating in the story they had written for me. I was simply watching it unfold, knowing that the ending was no longer theirs to decide. As the evening began to settle and guests slowly started gathering their things, I found myself drifting toward the quieter edges of the yard again, not because I felt pushed there, but because I preferred the clarity that came with distance. And it was in that quiet space, with the faint hum of conversation behind me and the soft glow of string lights overhead, that my mind began to trace its way backward, connecting moments that once felt separate into something far more deliberate. I remembered the first time Ethan had asked for help with a down payment on their house, how he had stood in my kitchen, shifting his weight slightly, explaining how it would only be temporary, how they just needed a little support to get started, and I had agreed without hesitation, writing a check that felt like an investment in his future, in their stability, in the idea of family moving forward together, and I had told myself that was what parents did, that was what love looked like. Then there were the renovations a few years later, the unexpected repairs that somehow became urgent, the conversations that always began with uncertainty and ended with quiet relief once I stepped in, each instance framed as an exception, each promise that it would not become a pattern, and yet the pattern had formed anyway, slowly, almost invisibly, until it became the expectation rather than the exception. I thought about holidays, about birthdays, about vacations I had partially funded without ever being fully included in, times when I was thanked politely but positioned just outside the center, as if my role was to support the experience rather than share in it. And I realized that none of it had been forced, none of it had been demanded outright, which made it all the more effective, because it allowed me to believe I was choosing it, that I was participating willingly, when in truth I had simply never paused long enough to ask what I was receiving in return. A burst of laughter from across the yard pulled me back to the present, and I saw Vanessa standing with a small group, her posture relaxed, her expression confident, and for a brief moment, I studied her not as a daughter-in-law, not even as family, but as someone who understood the system she was operating within, someone who had learned how to navigate it to her advantage. And I could not deny that there was a certain precision to it, a careful balance of charm and assumption that allowed her to move through situations without resistance. Ethan joined her shortly after, placing a hand on her back as they spoke, and the ease between them was unmistakable, not because it was particularly warm, but because it was aligned, because they shared the same understanding of how things worked, and I felt no sudden surge of anger watching them, no need to interrupt or confront, just a quiet acknowledgement that whatever this arrangement was, I had been the one sustaining it, and that realization carried a strange kind of calm with it, because if I had been the one sustaining it, then I also had the ability to stop. I reached for my purse, checking its contents with a simple, practiced motion, and my fingers brushed against the small folder I had placed there earlier that week, the one containing documents I had not yet shared with anyone, and I closed the purse again without taking anything out, because the timing was not about urgency, it was about certainty, and I had already moved past doubt. When I walked back toward the remaining guests, offering brief goodbyes and polite smiles, I noticed how natural it felt to disengage, how easy it was to step away without drawing attention. And as I made my way toward the front of the house, the sound of the party fading behind me, I understood that the most significant change had not been visible to anyone else. It had happened quietly, in the spaces between words and expectations, in the moment I chose to see the truth without softening it. And once seen, it could not be unseen, and more importantly, it could not be ignored. The drive home was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, not heavy, not filled with the usual replay of conversations or second-guessing of small moments, but clear, almost deliberate, as if my mind had finally decided to stop negotiating with itself and simply accept what had already been shown. The streetlights passed one by one outside my window, casting brief patterns of light across the dashboard, and I kept my hands steady on the wheel, thinking not about what had just happened, but about everything that had led up to it. The years of small accommodations, the quiet decisions I had made in favor of keeping peace, of being helpful, of maintaining a version of family that now felt more like a habit than a reality. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to defend those choices. I simply acknowledged them for what they were. When I reached my house and stepped inside, the stillness greeted me in a way that felt honest, not empty, not lonely, just unfiltered. And I placed my purse on the kitchen counter, removing my shoes with slow, practiced movements before walking into the living room where everything was exactly as I had left it earlier that day, nothing out of place, nothing demanding my attention, and I sat down in my usual chair, folding my hands in my lap for a moment before reaching for the small folder I had carried with me, setting it carefully on the table in front of me. I opened it without hesitation, flipping through the documents I had spent the past 2 weeks reviewing: bank statements, transfer records, notes I had written in the margins when something did not quite add up, and what had once seemed like scattered details now formed a clear picture, one that was difficult to ignore once it had been assembled, because it showed not just occasional support, but a consistent pattern of reliance that had quietly shifted into expectation, and expectation, left unchecked, had become entitlement. I traced one line with my finger, a series of monthly transfers that had started small and gradually increased over time, each one justified in the moment, each one explained as temporary, and I remembered the conversations that had accompanied them, the reassurance in Ethan's voice, the polite gratitude in Vanessa's tone, the way each request had been framed as reasonable, even necessary, and I realized that what I had interpreted as trust had been something else entirely, something far more calculated, because trust does not require repetition to prove itself. And yet here it was, repeated again and again until it became the foundation of how they operated. I leaned back slightly, letting the folder rest open on the table, and I allowed myself to sit with that understanding without rushing to fix it, without searching for excuses or softer explanations, because clarity does not need to be softened to be useful. It simply needs to be acknowledged, and once acknowledged, it changes the way everything else is seen. My phone buzzed softly on the counter, and when I glanced at it, I saw Ethan's name appear on the screen, followed by a brief message asking if I had made it home safely. And I looked at the words for a moment before setting the phone back down without responding, not out of anger, but out of intention, because for once, I did not feel compelled to maintain the rhythm they were used to, the immediate reply, the reassurance, the continuation of a pattern that no longer served me. Instead, I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top of it, feeling the quiet weight of the decision I had already made. And in that moment, sitting alone in a room that finally felt entirely my own, I understood that what came next would not require confrontation or raised voices or dramatic declarations. It would require something far simpler and far more effective: consistency. The same consistency that had built the pattern in the first place, now applied in a different direction, one that did not include unquestioned giving, one that did not depend on their expectations, one that belonged entirely to me. The next morning arrived without urgency, the sunlight filtering through the curtains in a soft, steady way that made everything feel almost ordinary, and I moved through my routine with the same quiet precision I had maintained for years, making coffee, setting a single cup on the kitchen counter, and sitting down at the table with the folder still within reach, not because I needed to look at it again, but because I wanted to remind myself that what I had seen the night before was not a passing thought. It was a decision. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the silence of the house settle around me. And for the first time in a long while, it did not feel like something to fill it. Felt like something to protect, something that belonged entirely to me without expectation or interruption. After a few minutes, I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in quite some time: Daniel Harper, a man who had handled several legal matters for my husband and me over the years, someone who understood not just numbers and documents, but the quiet complexities that often sit behind them, and I pressed call without hesitation. His voice was the same as I remembered, steady, attentive, and when I asked if he had time to meet later that week, he agreed without asking too many questions, which I appreciated, because I was not looking for reassurance, I was looking for clarity. The rest of the morning passed calmly, And when I arrived at his office that afternoon, the familiar scent of polished wood and paper greeted me, a setting that had always represented order and structure, things that felt particularly important now. And as I sat across from him, I placed the folder on his desk and opened it with deliberate care, guiding him through the documents, the transfers, the notes I had made, explaining not with emotion, but with precision, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Daniel listened without interruption, occasionally making a small note or asking a brief question, and when I finished, he leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than surprised, as if he had seen variations of this pattern before, and in a calm, measured tone, he outlined the options available to me, not in dramatic terms, but in practical steps, adjustments to accounts, changes to access, revisions to documents that would shift control back where it belonged. And I found that his approach matched my own, quiet, structured, effective. We spent the next hour reviewing each possibility, discussing what needed to be done immediately and what could be handled over time. And by the end of the meeting, I had signed several papers, nothing outwardly dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, but each signature carried a weight that I understood fully, because it marked the beginning of a different pattern, one built not on assumption, but on intention. When I left his office, the afternoon light felt sharper, more defined, and as I walked to my car, I realized that there was no sense of loss attached to what I had just done, no hesitation, no second thoughts, only a quiet certainty that I had taken the first real step in a direction that had been waiting for me to choose it. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again with another message from Ethan, this time asking about a small expense related to the party, something about a final payment that needed to be covered, and I looked at the message for a moment before setting the phone down on the table beside me, not responding immediately, not out of avoidance, but because for the first time, I was allowing space between their expectation and my action, and in that space, something new was beginning to take shape, something they would not recognize at first, but something that would soon become impossible for them to ignore. The message from Ethan remained unanswered for the rest of that evening, and when the next morning came, I noticed another one waiting on my phone, slightly longer this time, more specific, asking if I had seen his previous text and mentioning that the payment was time-sensitive, and I read it once, then set the phone down again without replying, not because I was ignoring him, but because I was choosing something different, something that felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping out of a rhythm that had guided me for years. I went about my day as usual, watering the plants by the window, folding a small stack of laundry, letting the hours pass without rushing to fill the silence with obligation, and I could feel the subtle shift in myself with each passing moment, the absence of that immediate response no longer uncomfortable, but steady, intentional. By the afternoon, Ethan called, his name lighting up the screen in a way that once would have prompted an instant answer, but this time, I let it ring through before listening to the voicemail he left behind. His voice calm at first, then slightly strained as he explained again about the outstanding cost, adding that Vanessa had already arranged everything, assuming it would be covered. And there it was again, that word, assuming, spoken casually as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and I sat there for a moment, holding the phone in my hand, letting that single word settle into place with everything else I had begun to understand. When I finally called him back later that evening, my voice was even, measured, and when he answered, there was a brief pause on the other end, as if he had expected something different, perhaps urgency, perhaps apology, but I offered neither. Instead, I asked how he was, listened to his answer, and allowed the conversation to unfold without rushing toward the topic he clearly wanted to address. And when he eventually brought it up, explaining once more that the final payment needed to be completed, I responded with a simple sentence that felt far more significant than its length suggested. I said, "I will not be covering that expense." The silence that followed was immediate, not loud, not confrontational, but unmistakable, and I could almost hear the shift in his understanding as he processed what I had said, as if the possibility had never occurred to him before that I might answer differently. He asked if everything was all right, his tone careful now, searching for context, for a reason that would fit within the pattern he knew, and I told him that everything was fine, that I had simply decided to handle my finances differently moving forward, and I did not elaborate. I did not explain the details, because this was not a negotiation, it was a boundary, and boundaries do not require lengthy justification to be valid. He hesitated, then mentioned that Vanessa had already told people the payment would be taken care of, and I let that statement pass without reaction, because I understood what it really meant, not concern, but inconvenience, not confusion, but disruption. And I repeated calmly that I would not be covering it, allowing the words to stand on their own, without softening them. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly for a moment, noticing the absence of the usual follow-up questions I might have asked myself in the past, the doubt, the second-guessing, and instead there was only stillness, a quiet confirmation that the change I had set in motion was no longer internal. It had begun to take shape in the world outside of me, and while they might not understand it yet, while they might even resist it, I knew that this was only the beginning, not of conflict, but of clarity, and once clarity takes hold, it does not easily release its grip. The shift did not announce itself loudly. It did not arrive with confrontation or raised voices. It settled quietly into the spaces where expectation used to live, and over the next few days, I watched as that absence began to ripple outward in ways that were both subtle and unmistakable. The first sign came in the form of a shorter message from Ethan, less certain this time, asking if I might reconsider, explaining that things had already been promised, that it would be awkward to change plans. Now, and I read it carefully, noticing not what was said, but what was not. There was no mention of understanding my decision, no curiosity about why things had changed, only the inconvenience of adjusting to it. And I set the phone down once again without responding immediately, allowing that familiar pause to stretch a little longer, because I had come to understand that time itself can be a response, one that creates space where none existed before. Later that afternoon, Vanessa called, something she rarely did directly, and her voice was polished, composed, carrying the same effortless confidence she displayed at the party. But there was a slight edge beneath it now, something tighter, less certain, and she spoke in careful phrases, mentioning how much effort had gone into the event, how everything had been arranged based on certain expectations, and I listened without interruption, not because I agreed, but because I no longer felt the need to interrupt in order to be heard. When she finished, I responded in the same calm tone I had used with Ethan, telling her that I understood the situation, but that I would not be contributing further, and I let the sentence rest there without explanation, without apology, because I had already explained enough over the years. Through my actions, and this moment did not require anything more. There was a brief silence on her end, followed by a small shift in her tone, less polished now, more direct, as she asked if something had happened, if there was a reason for the change, and I considered the question for a moment before answering simply that I had made a decision about how I would be handling things moving forward, and that it was not open for discussion. And I could feel the difference in that statement, not in volume, but in weight, because it did not invite negotiation. It did not leave room for reinterpretation. It stood on its own. She tried once more, mentioning how family should support each other, how everyone relied on one another, and I recognized the phrasing, the careful framing that had worked so effectively in the past, but now it felt distant, almost rehearsed. And I responded by saying that support should not be assumed, it should be appreciated, and that I believed it was time for things to be balanced differently, and I did not elaborate further. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly, noticing how the air in the room felt unchanged, how the walls did not close in, how nothing around me reacted to what had just taken place. And that was when I understood that the weight of those conversations had never truly belonged to the situation itself. It had belonged to the expectations I carried into them, expectations that were no longer there. Over the next couple of days, the messages slowed, the calls became less frequent, and when they did come, they were shorter, more cautious, as if each word was being measured against a version of me they were no longer certain of. And I moved through that time with the same steady rhythm, attending to my own routines, keeping my decisions consistent, not as a reaction, but as a continuation, because consistency, I had learned, was what gave a decision its shape, and as that shape became clearer, I could see the outline of something new forming, something that did not depend on their understanding or their approval, something that existed simply because I had chosen it, and that choice, once made and maintained, had already begun to change everything. By the end of the week, the silence between us had settled into something more permanent, not hostile, not dramatic, just different, as if a familiar structure had been quietly dismantled piece by piece until there was nothing left to lean on. And I noticed it most in the absence of small things. No casual updates from Ethan, no forwarded photos from Vanessa, no subtle hints disguised as conversation starters. And in that absence, I found a clarity that had been missing for years. One afternoon, I received a final message from Ethan, longer than the others, more carefully worded, explaining that they had managed to cover the remaining costs themselves, that everything had worked out, and there was a brief line at the end thanking me for everything I had done in the past. And I read it slowly, not for what it said, but for what it revealed, because for the first time, there was a separation between what I had done and what they expected me to do. And that separation, small as it was, marked a shift that could not be undone. I placed the phone down and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same view I had seen every day for years, and yet it felt different now, not because anything outside had changed, but because something inside me had settled into place, something that no longer needed validation or acknowledgement to exist. Later that evening, I opened the folder once more, not to review the documents, but to close that chapter with intention, sliding the papers neatly back into place before setting it aside in a drawer, knowing that everything it represented had already been acted upon, that the decisions had been made and were now part of the structure of my life moving forward. A few days later, I received an invitation to a small family dinner, nothing elaborate, just a simple gathering at Ethan and Vanessa's house. And I considered it for a moment before responding that I would attend, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to see what remained when expectation was removed. When I arrived that evening, the atmosphere was noticeably different, quieter, more measured, and Vanessa greeted me with the same polished smile, but it lacked the easy confidence it once held, as if she were adjusting to something she could not quite define. And Ethan seemed more attentive, asking if I needed anything, offering small courtesies that had been absent before, and I accepted them with the same calm neutrality I had carried with me all week, neither encouraging nor dismissing, simply acknowledging them as they were. The conversation moved carefully, avoiding certain topics, circling around safe ground, and I participated without overextending, without filling the silence the way I once would have, allowing pauses to exist without rushing to resolve them. And in those pauses, I could see the shift more clearly than in any words spoken, because without the unspoken agreement that had guided us before, everything now required intention, and intention cannot hide behind assumption. When the evening ended and I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt a sense of completion, not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer needed it to be. And as I walked to my car, I understood that what I had reclaimed was not just control over my finances, but something far more fundamental, the ability to define my place in my own life without relying on how others chose to see me. And as I drove away, I did not look back, not out of resentment, but because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore, only a quiet, steady path ahead shaped by decisions that were finally, completely my own.